So I'd like to welcome you all this evening to our next webinar. We are looking at how can we influence UK economic policy in the UK from a Christian perspective, and I'm delighted to welcome Andrew Henley to come and speak to us this evening. Andrew is an Emeritus Professor of Entrepreneurship and Economics at Cardiff Business School. He had previous appointments in Aberystwyth, Swansea and Kent Universities. But more importantly for tonight, he was a policy advisor to the Welsh Government in various capacities, including a 10-year term as an appointed member of the Welsh First Minister's Economic Research Advisory Panel. So I'll hand over to Andrew. Andrew's very keen that we make it more of a conversation tonight. So if you do want to chip in, just pop up your hand and we'll come to you, or you pop something in the meeting chat and we'll come to you then. Okay, I'll just hand over to you. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay, thank you very much, Sharon. Thank you for the invitation to join you. You've already given quite a good introduction. So I was going to say a few words about myself. I might expand a little bit if that's all right, because it might be useful for you to know a little bit about where I'm coming from, so to speak. So a bit about my background. I did a PhD in industrial economics at the University of Warwick, a long time ago, back in the early 80s. And then I've had nearly 40 years as a career academic. And I actually retired last Easter, slightly, maybe a bit early, but there were other things which I wanted to do, and I'll maybe say a bit about those in a moment. And actually, of those, most of my career has been spent in Wales. You mentioned University of Kent. I was there for 10 years, and then moved to Wales in the mid-90s, and have worked in 3 different universities in sort of relatively senior positions. So I've been the head of the business school at Swansea University. I was head of the law, business and information science at Aberystwyth University. I've had 2 stints. I live near Aberystwyth. And most recently, during my sort of time in Cardiff Business School, I had 5 years as their Director of Engagement and Research Engagement and Impact. So I don't know whether, if you know anything about higher education quality assurance, you might have heard of something called the Research Excellence Framework. Well, I had to manage the 2nd largest business school submission in the UK for research impact, and I had to steer these 10 enormous case studies through to evaluation, and that was the core part of my job. But it was basically off the back of a lot of my own experience in policy engagement. So Shona mentioned that I did 10 years as an advisor to Rhodri Morgan. I hasten to add, not as a political advisor, as an independent member of an economic research advisory panel, like a kind of economic council of advisors. And we were responsible for steering the economic research programme of the Welsh Government through that time. They would come to us with proposals for what they wanted to, ideas about what they wanted to research. We would discuss, challenge, reshape that programme, and then they would go away and commission it and come back and tell us what they'd found or what their consultants had found. The difference, there's a slightly different approach to in Scotland, because Scotland on devolution inherited a reasonably good cadre of professional of government economists in situ. In Wales, there was nothing like that. It was a complete shoestring operation. So there was very little analytical capacity and very little data, actually. So in those early years of devolution, we really had to kind of steer the ship. And we would meet reasonably frequently with Rhodri Morgan, and he'd sit there, and I don't know whether you remember him as First Minister, but he was a kind of folksy guy, but he was actually really quite smart. And had a very good breadth of history, so he kept us on our toes. I've also done quite a bit of work with in my own area of interest and expertise, which is around entrepreneurship and small business for the Welsh Government. So I've sat on youth entrepreneurship strategy panels. I've sat on other bits and pieces, and most recently been involved in the sort of strategy management group of the Business Wales, which is the whole business support operation in Wales for small businesses. And that's been through a huge period of turmoil, because it was mostly funded from European structural funds, and they all went, and they've had to sort of reinvent it and scale it back and try and do as much with less resource. And also, of course, during COVID. So we have a development bank in Wales, and I've had very good contacts with them. Colleagues in Cardiff Business School are involved in all the economic intelligence work that they do. And we did quite a bit of sort of work to support them on evaluation during COVID, where they were sitting in their bedrooms dishing out millions of pounds of emergency loans to businesses, if you can remember that far back and what life was like nearly 5 years ago now. But actually, evaluation is something that I've spoken quite a lot on. I've also been involved in post-Brexit, post-European Structural Fund programming, which actually hasn't really come off in Wales because it's been largely directed from London straight to local authorities and has short-circuited devolved government. But could say more about that, but certainly there was a lot of discussion around, well, if we have a big program that replaces structural funds, how should it be evaluated? And I'll maybe come on to some thoughts later about the issues around evaluation and how challenging that is for thinking about policy. And I've also done some work on small business leadership. I ran a small business leadership program across Wales for a few years ago. That was structural. That was with the European Structural Fund money. And I've most recently actually had a go at doing some similar stuff with clergy in Wales, which has been very interesting, and they seem to be well received. So I've been thinking about I've thought about the Christian perspectives on what I do for most of my career. I was a member of the been a member of the Association of Christian Economists for at least 30 years, probably 35 years, and actually for quite a while was involved in helping to run that, although I took more of a backseat recently. I know you've heard from, some of you might have listened to a webinar from my friend Michael Pollitt, who I think was talking to you a few weeks ago. So what am I doing now that I'm retired? Well, I'm busier than ever. I've ended up being appointed to the Board of Finance of the Anglican Diocese of St David's, which is this huge area of southwest Wales with about 300 churches in it, most of whom have very small congregations, and is struggling a bit financially. And we are going through a major strategy exercise, which I'm very much involved with my wife, actually. And I'm also treasurer of our own large Anglican church here in Aberystwyth, which it's certainly one of the largest Anglican churches in Wales, but that's not saying very much. But we do have anyway, I have to grapple with a £300,000 a year budget and a big deficit at the moment, so that keeps me busy. And I'm married. I've got 3 children, the eldest of whom is an Anglican clergyman and is in charge of a big chunk of Cardiff, and 2 grandchildren. So that's me. I think it's probably fair to say that it's not easy to think about economics from a Christian perspective, because Christian values often appear to be at odds with the methodological assumptions of economics. If I try and guess what Michael Pollitt had to say to you, he probably would be more comfortable with the methodological assumptions of economics and Christian values than I am. But we still work in very much the same framework. And so advising on policy making, and then being both an academic thinking, trying to research the subject, but also trying to think about policy and policy making, I think it requires a level of pragmatism and realism, which is often perhaps at odds with both one's ideals about what economics should be methodologically as a subject, and it regards itself as this sort of very robust social scientific type subject, which has a very clear understanding of how it thinks people behave and what incentivizes them, and then on the other hand, ideals about what the kingdom of God ought to be like, and really which is perhaps very much at odds with the rather pessimistic view of the world that economists are often accused of having. The famous quote about economics being a dismal science. Carlyle, I think it was, who said that. So let me say, so I've got a few sort of questions which I'm going to work my way through, and you may well have your own opinions on these. But the first question want to ask is, does the Bible contain an economic policy manual? Now, the Bible actually has quite a lot to say about economics once you start digging into it. But there are equally reasons for thinking that what it has to say, it's quite difficult to apply to the modern world. It's in practical terms, it's somewhat limited as a manual for how to design good contemporary economic policy, even though it's got a lot to say about economic values and economic ideas. The first reason will be the obvious one, that agrarian societies of 2,000 to 4,000 years ago are barely relevant to modern, complex, industrialized, globalized economies. The world that we see described and the societal and economic relationships we see described in the Old Testament are, it could be argued, at a big remove from the world that we see in front of us in terms of the modern economy and how complex that is and interrelated. It's not a land-based agrarian economy. It's one in which, you know, people's main asset is their skills, and many of them work in certainly in the UK in services. They certainly don't work in farming. Still a few make things, but the majority of people are actually involved in some sort of service activity, important activities at that. The second objection, I suppose, which sometimes you hear, is to say, well, you know, that's the Old Testament, but if we focus on the New Testament, there's perhaps less. I mean, there is stuff about economic relationships in the New Testament, but how do you think about what's there? It's perhaps more concerned with personal salvation than the wider redemption of society. I would disagree vehemently with that statement, because I think they're both equally important, but you could see that those sorts of arguments might be applied. So the first of those, the idea that, well, applying what we read about very more simple agrarian type societies is difficult today, is a sort of, you could call it a hermeneutical problem. And the second, as I've said, I think is just manifestly wrong, because I think if we think about the kingdom of God and we think about what the kingdom of God is about, it's about transforming society here and now, but it's also about what is to come in the future. It's not just, you know, pie in the sky when we die. It's the outworking of our Christian faith is very much about transforming society now, in the here and now. So lots of ideas about what the Bible has to say about economics. In Genesis, we read a lot about work and stewardship and economic responsibility, the commission that Adam and Eve are given, and the implications of that in terms of care for the natural world and to be economically as well as humanly fruitful. There's an awful lot in Leviticus about regulating the economic relationships between the individual components, the tribes and the people of the children of Israel. Lot in there that suggests that God is very concerned about issues of wealth, resources, opportunity, Leviticus 25, and the idea of the Jubilee. And also the important idea, perhaps, that obedience to God leads to economic prosperity in Leviticus 28. But I mean, that's just, you know, very sketchy overview. I mean, there's all sorts of ideas in there about, you know, rights for gleaning and things like that, and you can draw implications about what that means about social protection and all the rest of it. And then once we move into the prophets, you know, you can pull stuff out there. I mean, the one that's often pulled out is Amos chapter 5, where economic justice, weights and measures, is seen as just as important as personal righteousness. So justice and righteousness, which is the same word in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew, is very much about economic relationships as it is about personal righteousness. In the New Testament, well, what's going on in the parables? Well, that's a big question, because, you know, you could debate all night about what, you know, whether there is an implied ideas about economics or about the right to manage of vineyard owners and things in some of Jesus's parables, or whether they are really just meant to be parables about the kingdom of God and about our personal relationship with that. But of course, in the writings of Paul, we see some very important economic propositions, the love of money being the root of all evil in First Timothy. And I also throw in here for you to think about in Revelation 18, arguably the picture of the demise of an economic superpower, which may be interpreted as a sort of, a picture of the Roman Empire at the time, but certainly it seems to suggest that, get it wrong, become a sort of economic superpower, exploit your monopoly power, and God's judgment will fall on you. So what do we make of all of that? Well, there's an awful lot there, and I have to say that over the last 30 years and certainly longer, a lot longer, Christians who are economists have been discussing and arguing and reaching all sorts of different conclusions about this stuff. But I think what I would like to say is that that's fine, that's okay. But what Christian economists need to do is, just like all the rest of the church, of the people of faith, we need to act as salt and light in the world. We need to serve as ambassadors for the gospel as much as we would expect that of any other profession, whether it's teachers or doctors or whoever. And I remember years ago, John Stott, oddly enough, here in Aberystwyth, making the point that he thought we needed to pray that God would raise up Christian economists who would engage in this world and would be salt and light in it. So I've tried to do my little bit, I suppose, over the years. I think so. We stand, I think, and this is the core of what I probably want to say, and I'll unpack it in a bit more detail. We stand as a bridge between the world of the sort of what I call instrumentally rational Homo economicus, in brackets, a Scottish invention, incidentally, by the great man from Kirkcaldy, Adam Smith. Everybody goes back to the Wealth of Nations and says, well, it all starts with him. He's the person who really portrays this picture of the individually rational economic agent who, when engaging with lots of other economically rational agents, leads to the greatest good. The greatest, no, it wasn't him, that was a later thinker, but Bentham, I suppose. But the famous quote about our dinner doesn't arrive on our table because of the benevolence of the butcher and the baker; it arrives because of their self-interest. I loosely quote that. But so we've got that bridge between that world of the rational Homo economicus and what I'd call the onward dynamic of the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God, which is both now and not yet. And we've somehow got to sort of bridge the two. We're stuck between a messy, compromised world and God's vision of a good society and a good economy. So I would say that if you retreat into the abstract world of pure economic theory, then, well, I mean, there are plenty of my colleagues who do that, and that's fine. But I would say that that's a difficult option if you actually want to engage in the world of policy. You want to have something useful to say. You're probably going to have to think about this in a more pragmatic way. If economists have nothing to prescribe and they merely describe, and of course a lot of the sort of fun methodological underpinning of economics is say, well, it's a positive subject. We'll tell you what the world looks like. We'll tell you that if you do this, then that will happen. We're not going to tell you what to do. That's you, politicians. Economists will advise you and tell you how the model works. You, the politicians, have to then decide what you then want to do with that. But ultimately, I think, if we sort of retreat into the abstract, we've not got a lot to offer, because politicians, in my experience, don't have a lot of time for very abstract, high principled, high theory. They want to know which, and this is an analogy I've used a lot, they want to know which levers to push and pull in the signal box. So back in 1988, an American Christian economist called David Richardson concluded controversially that the key aim of a Christian economist is simply to do good economics. Somebody called a professor at Oxford, Donald Hay, who was one of the leading lights in the Association of Christian Economists for many years and a dear friend of mine. Donald, in his book back in 2001 called Economics Today, which is still very much quoted but difficult to get hold of because it's been out of print for so long. He describes that approach as basically being a subversive approach. Be a good Christian, do good economics, and don't be afraid to give a reason for it if you're asked, but actually to be the kind of subversive salt and light in the world. So that's sort of my kind of take on thinking about economics as a subject. But behind what the other aspect of the story, I think, of Christian economics over the last 20 or 30 years has been continually developing conversations between economists and theologians. Well, not theologians of all sorts of flavors, actually. So biblical scholars, ethicists, practitioners, and I'd add to that politicians and policymakers. But the conversation with theologians, which Rob Tatum has been chairing through the sort of hub that the Kirby Lang Institute in Cambridge have set up, has been quite interesting. But that I've had other rounds of that conversation earlier with theologians. It's not been easy. It's two-way. It involves a lot of listening, and the listening is a skill that is not always associated with economists, sadly, because we tend to be, as a profession, a bit too dismissive of other scholars in social sciences and in other humanities subjects because of this sort of slight methodological arrogance that economists sometimes come across as having. So I think constructive engagement is really important. Otherwise, we just become kind of preachy idealists. And those ideas then get dismissed by people who need to use them to translate them into policy as being impractical or irrelevant to the contemporary world. So it sounds a little bit negative, but I want to temper that again by saying we have good news to proclaim in all of that. So I've got a couple of questions I pose myself, and the first of these is, well, these are set in the sort of tension. I wrote a paper for the Christian Economists a few years ago, and I think I called it something like constructive engagement or prophetic detachment. And my conclusion actually was that we needed to be both, need to be constructively engaged and at times prophetically detached. So there is the question of, is mainstream economics any use? Some Christian economists, such as Michael Pollock, will say absolutely yes, it is. It's a really useful subject. It's got a toolkit that's really well thought through. It allows us to analyze the world and to make clear predictions about what will happen if certain policies, measures are introduced or changed, or regulatory regulations are changed, and how markets might respond to those. But there are others who would be more skeptical. Eve Poole wrote a book a few years ago called Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions, in which she goes through, I can't remember how many there were, but there's probably about 10 of them, listing through these and saying, you know, there are all these assumptions that really underpin modern capitalist economies, and many of them are really quite toxic and problematic. And I think there has been a long debate over the years within the sort of world of Christian economics about, well, how much of it is toxic and how much of it's usable. Now, if you think that it's all really toxic and you want to throw Adam Smith and everybody from the last 250 years since out the window, then and say that the neoclassical basis to modern economics is so irredeemably beyond the pale that we need to start from something else, you're probably what I'd call a reconstructionist. You want to reconstruct something completely new. But I think there's huge problems there, because it's back to this problem of, well, there's a lot in the Bible about economics, but it's very difficult to see how we do apply it to the modern world. Now, I have people I know who will say, actually, we should ban interest from a modern economy. And I go, well, how's that going to work? Well, we can debate that, but I mean, you know, there's another very religious tradition aside, that's completely separate from Christian economics, of course, which does try and run economies without interest rates. It ends up mimicking interest rates, is my take on that. And you might come up with other ideas, that you would want to pull out and say, we should do that. Should we have a complete debt forgiveness event every 49 years? Interesting thought, but would that really work in practice? Or do we need to extract from these ideas the underlying principle? What is it that God is actually saying when he wants the children of Israel to have these policies in place? And there's a sort of an ethical critique of modern economics as well, which says, well, what's normal and praiseworthy in mainstream economics is not consistent with Christian social ethics. So on the one hand, we've got self-interest. People are motivated to do economically rational things through self-interest. That was Adam Smith's big contribution in The Wealth of Nations. He actually said something rather different in his Theory of Moral Sentiments, which economists don't read. They just read The Wealth of Nations. But there's that on that side, and on the Christian side, there's the idea that, well, actually, shouldn't we be concerned about virtues? There is also the methodological critique. So that's the ethical critique, and I'll say a bit more about virtue in a minute. But there's the methodological critique that says, well, economics basically has got the wrong objective. It's got the wrong telos. Economics is all about maximizing utility, and then that gets translated into, in practical economic terms, into growth, productivity, earnings. But is that what the Bible teaches us that we should be pursuing as Christians? Perhaps not. So should we pursue policies that are trying to aim for different objectives? And in brackets here, incidentally, I should add that in Wales, we have had for the last 10 years or so, something called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. We were one of the first, we're not an independent country, but for the sake of argument, they say, well, we are the first country in the world to adopt a Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And other countries have come along and taken a lot of interest in that. How does that work in practice? It hasn't really got serious teeth, but it does inform a lot of thinking about policy, and says, before you do that, you need to think about what that implies for the well-being of future generations. And it broadens the objective set. It says it's not just purely about growth and productivity. Important though those things might be, other things also matter that are important to people. Second question, so that was my sort of first question there, was, is mainstream economics of any use? And the second question was, is there a case for doing nothing in response to the problems of mainstream economics? And this is the sort of, apologies for using this word, but this is a kind of schizophrenic approach to Christian economics, which says, well, we just do good mainstream economics during the week, and then on Sundays we'll go to church and be good Christians. And the two worlds don't meet. And I can think of people who I've discovered over the years are faithful Christians, but actually have stayed well away from the thinking of the world of Christian economics. I'm not sure why that is. We're broad church and very happy to welcome people. But people who I know are people of faith, but would just get on with the subject and generally do it well. We can't, the sort of more important point here is to say, well, can we as Christians impose a Christian economic paradigm on the rest of the world? The UK now, people who profess to be Christian is perhaps, 50% in the last census. A large fraction of the population now claim to have no religious affiliation whatsoever. Can we actually impose a Christian world view of the economy and wider society on them, or do we have to be a bit more subversive? Anyway, there may be no single Christian vision of the economic order anyway, so it might be best. The sort of dismal conclusion here is to say, well, it might be best to leave our theology at home and just keep silent and do the best we can in terms of advising on policy. Another a member of the American Association of Christian Economists quite a few years ago said, well, the problem here is it just leads to bad economics and watered down Christianity. So it'd be better to be good economists Monday to Friday and be good Christians on Sunday and not have water both of those down. Is there a middle way then? I would say there probably is a middle way. It's possible to do good economics and maintain an authentic Christian witness. And this approach actually does have a long tradition, actually in Anglican theology in the UK, but I'm not exclusively claiming it for Anglicans. I think it involves others. That you can see it also in writings in the States from people who would come from a Methodist background, for example. But it's particularly associated with two now long since, not so long in one case actually, dead theologians, but Ronald Preston and John Atherton. John Atherton was a sort of a student of Ronald Preston. Ronald Preston was writing up until about the 1980s and wrote a series of books about capitalism. John Atherton wrote quite a useful book also around that time. And Donald Hayes' approach, I mentioned Donald, who's former professor of economics, industrial economics at Oxford. His approach is also very similar. It goes under a number of different names. It goes under some people say middle axioms. I think that might have been Preston's phrase. Or Donald Hay talks about derivative social principles. Or sometimes it's talked about the search for interim solutions. What kind of important principles should we be promoting when advising on developing economic policy? What might those principles look like in the pragmatic world of policy engagement? And so there would be things like provide good, meaningful work for people, responsible care for God's good creation, which when Donald Hay was first talking about that in 2001 was nowhere near as big an issue as it is now. I don't think there'd be very much. People might debate whether it's God's good creation, but there's no debate about, not much debate anyway, about the importance of responsible care. Economic justice and the offering of economic opportunity for all, and an obligation to support and provide for the poor. The problem here, of course, is that those are good principles, but then how do you translate those into actually the fine detail of policy? And then we could still end up arguing. So I don't really have a definitive question to that, because I may take a very well argued and I think coherent view as to what the best way to, for example, support and provide for the poor might be, and an equally faithful, responsible, professional economist who's a Christian might come up with a different approach. So what does Christian economics bring to the policy table? I'll try and rattle through this now. The first point I want to talk about is virtue. I think virtue ethics is quite important. I think we should focus not just on the outcome of policy decisions, but we should put an equal emphasis on the motives and virtues of those who make those decisions. Just as we should also do that for thinking about how people behave in the economic world, not just about, are they making decisions that are consistent with good outcomes, but are they actually making those decisions in a virtuous manner? And I could say an awful lot more about this, but there's a chapter in a book called Theology and Economics that a number of us contributed to. It was the outcome of a conversation between theologians and economists about 9 years ago, called Theology and Economics, which I wrote a chapter which I argued for a lot more thinking on the idea of virtue. What I'd summarize is to say, well, justice is an important virtue, and justice is it's a key virtue, and it's a dynamic activity. The Bible tells us it's a dynamic thing. It's not just, justice isn't a static state where we get to and we have, right, we've enacted some good policies, we've now reached a just world. Micah 6:8 tells us to, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness and walk humbly with your God. So it's doing justice is virtuous, and it's dynamic and ongoing. So virtue, vision is my second one. I think Christian economists need to provide a compelling narrative, a hopeful and compelling narrative about what the kingdom of God should look like. We see that contrasted in the Bible between the dismal world of Ecclesiastes. First chapter, verse 3, talks about the futility of pursuing a narrow conception of, well, it could be argued, and it has been argued, that it's talking about the futility of a narrow approach to economic growth. What do people gain from all the toil at which they toil under the sun? And the writer of that book laments the fact that so much about economic life and society just appears to be pointless. So we need to explain what the point is. And I mentioned well-being, the well-being, in our case, the Well-being of Future Generations Act here in Wales. And I think also the pandemic served to remind us that, if we needed to be reminded as Christian economists, that not everything that matters is economic value. There are other things that have value as over and above just economic value. I mean, we discovered quite a lot about how important other things were in life, I think. So telos, the objective, matters, but it should be neither GDP nor the simple aggregation of personal happiness. I think Christians have an important point to make about what our purpose is here, and what the kingdom of God is leading to. And the third thing I'd talk about is reason, thinking, and revelation. Good reasoning is not to be dismissed by Christians. We are, Paul tells us to reason out our faith, or to the scholastics, particularly St. Thomas Aquinas, teaches us that faith is a reasoned activity. And faith also opens up the possibility that knowledge can be revealed to us. So my approach, perhaps as a Christian who's an economist, which might be different from somebody who's not, would be to say, actually, I can think of occasions in my professional life when I've sat and prayed for revelation on a particular topic, to unlock something. It's not unreasonable for us to think that actually there is divine revelation that can come into our discussions and thinking. The point here is that secular or mainstream economics is not necessarily wrong. It's just incomplete and unreliable, because it goes about its work in the absence of any appreciation of the importance of God's normative intentions for us for human life. And I think God's intentions are both spiritual and material. I've got a quote here from Rowan Williams, who said back in 2000 in one of his books, they're often very dense reads, Rowan Williams, but anyway, he says, "We could say that revelation decisively advances or extends debate, extends rather than limits the range of ambiguity and conflict in language. It poses fresh questions rather than answering old ones." And I think that's quite a really nice thing to try and apply in economics. So very nearly at the end of what I want to say, and then we can open it up for conversation. I think, so how can economics, and specifically Christian economics, influence policy and practice? Perhaps this is what you're really interested in, would like to talk about. I think economists and Christian economists bring particular and important skill sets to the table. So this is back to my conclusion that actually we should do economics well. Don't do sort of, watered down economics. And not just do it differently. I think be explicit, at least to ourselves anyway, about the Christian values that inform the choices that we are presenting and we're making in the analysis that we present. So I think it's important to be honest, at least with ourselves, and if somebody asks us, then to be honest about if we are asked, where are you coming from on this issue? Second thing to say is that impact is never precise and exact, and I've learned a lot about this over the years that I've been involved in research impact, and thinking about the impact of my own research, but also thinking about the impact of the research of others, and doing a lot of work actually also for one of the research councils on evaluating project proposals, reviewing those projects once they're underway, because the big question, as always, and it's a question that's pushed from politicians down to academics, is to say, we want to know what impact this work that we are paying for is having. So it's never precise and exact. The transfer of knowledge, in brackets, revelation. So, you know, the transfer of knowledge could be an aspect of revelation, requires good relationships and professionalism. It requires trust building. So don't be afraid, I would say to myself, to challenge the implicit biases and blind spots that exist in the policy making process. I've often found myself asking the question when I've been in, you know, with officials, policy, those responsible for designing or implementing policy. I often find myself and others asking the question, well, what exactly is the market failure here that you think this proposal addresses? So, you know, those are the kind of questions that we should be posing in challenge. But equally, just because I've come along with one piece of analysis and I've got a lovely statistically significant regression coefficient that tells me that when you change X, Y happens, don't expect policymakers to change their policy simply on the basis of this wonderful number that you've come across and you think is better than everybody else's number. And I've been told that time and again by people in the policy world. There's a weight of argument issue here. You have to sort of marshal the evidence, and policy will eventually perhaps shift in the direction you want to see it. It won't be designed off the back of one piece of evidence. Even though to get your work published, often as a young economist, you have to turn around and say, well, my number is better than everybody else's number because there's this reason, this reason, this reason, and this reason why their numbers are all wrong. And that's how the academic publication process works. And so then you go along to the policymaker and you go, well, that number is wrong, and their number was wrong, and their number's wrong. So my number is right because I have done this, this, and this. And they go, really? So part evidence, part hypothesized impact on the basis of logic model. Policymakers like to have logic models, so they need to be taken through the logic of saying, well, if you pull this lever, what is the causal process that will lead to something that we want to see happening? So the final thing I'd say, and then I've got 3 points to sum up with. The final thing to say is that work with the policy making process, work where it is. So they may already have got a load of evidence, which you might disagree with, but it's there and you can't just brush it aside. They may well have already progressed some way along with this. And I was listening, I was talking to Shona earlier about setting up running a forum and a conference a couple of weeks ago where we had people from what in England are now called the combined mayoral authorities, and we had 3 in the room, and one of them was talking to us. We'd invited a contribution from this person and made this point that we have to work with where they've got to. Don't come in and throw all the toys out the pram and say you've started from the wrong place. You've got to go back to first principles and do this, this, and this, because they'll probably nod politely and show you the door. And also just a comment about impact and the way impact works. Economists, particularly in my experience, have quite a linear view of impact. Other academics in the social sciences, less so. So economists say, well, here's my research. Here's what it shows. I'm going to go and tell you all about this. You're going to listen very carefully, design good policy, and things will improve. And then I will be able to measure what you've done and see how it's improved. And I will be able to write my nice impact case study and tell you that my research has led to this happening. But actually, in practice, the impact is more circular. It's what economists call a co-creation process. And that takes more time, it takes more work, and it takes a lot more thought. And academics in other social sciences particularly they seem to understand that. So I've lived most of my academic life moving between the world of economics and business and business and management academics tend to have a much better appreciation, because they're not all economists. Many of them come from a sort of more sociological, organizational science understanding of the world, and they understand that you've got to then get into the process, involve the policymakers, co-create the research program, and then lead to the policy change. So three very quick summary points in terms of infiltration or subversion. One sign: Christians should model economic virtuous behavior as a sign of the kingdom of God, and to some extent therefore reject, not entirely reject, but have a realistic view of the importance of economic man. The second, so that's sign. Second is substance. Work as salt and light in the social and economic sphere to bring God's priorities to the fore. So this is about sort of, saying, get stuck in there and be salt and light in this world, and you may well push and steer the process to something that maybe accords better with what, as Christians, we'd like to see going on. And then style. Back to the John Stott point, pray that God will raise up skilled economists and others who can speak with authority. So people who can do it well and do it with, and therefore command a level of authority in that. And so that's roughly, that's it. That's what I wanted to say. And I'm very happy. I mean, you may well have questions that sort of want to talk about specifics, and I haven't said very much about particular areas of policy here. I realize that, but I'm very happy to the conversation to move into that, although with the proviso that I'm not an expert on macroeconomics, but I do know a bit more about sort of the world of business, small business, entrepreneurship, regional development.
So I will restart. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time tonight, Andrew. That was really a fascinating conversation about how we can start influencing economic policy and what position we should start from, and where we should end up as well. So thank you so much for your time this evening. Thank you for all of those who attended. Our next webinar is next Tuesday, when we're looking on how do we engage with asylum seekers within our churches and communities. And so it would be great if we see some of you next Tuesday as well. So thank you very much to you all, and just to say goodbye and good night. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great.
Thanks.
Thanks all.